We can tell this is a formal event because there's an introducer of the introducer. That's how you can tell it's a really class affair. So I'm Lynn Neihart. I'm president of the History of Science Society, and I'd like to welcome you all to the 2013 HSS Distinguished Lecture. In 1988, the Joseph Hazen Foundation agreed to endow a lecture that would be delivered each year at our annual meeting. Mr. Hazen's philanthropy included medical, cultural, and educational institutions, but it was his interest in Albert Einstein that formed the basis of a long and close collaboration with the historian of science, Jerry Holton. And this association resulted in significant contributions to the History of Science Society, including tonight's lecture. Each distinguished lecturer is chosen for his or her ability to speak on a topic of wide interest, intended to attract all the members of the society, scholars working in a variety of other fields, and interested members of the larger public. Speakers are asked to avoid narrowly technical discussions that are of interest only to highly specialized audiences, rather than the very broad audience that is us. So it is my pleasure to introduce Bernie Lightman, who is not tonight's speaker, but the introducer of tonight's speaker. Bernie is professor of humanities at York University, and as you all know, is the History of Science Society's editor who will be finishing his term in the coming year. So as not to let me take more time before we get to the main event, I'm going to turn over the podium to him now.
Thank you, Lynn. It's my great honor to introduce Professor James Secord as this year's Distinguished Lecturer. After receiving his PhD in 1981 from the History of Science program at Princeton, Jim taught at the Imperial College in London and then at the University of Cambridge, where he is now professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. In 2006, he became the director of the Darwin Correspondence Project at Cambridge, which has thrived under his leadership. Many of you will be familiar with his many articles, book chapters, and major publications on the cultural history of 19th century British science. In fact, I have empirical proof that Jim's work is widely read. You may recall that to celebrate the ISIS centenary, the University of Chicago Press asked our readers to vote on the top 5 articles that have appeared in the journal since it started in 1913 with George Sarton at the helm. Although Jim's article, Knowledge in Transit, published in 2004, was not in the top 5, it was in the top 10. If you look at the ISIS website, you'll see that this same article was in the top 20 ISIS articles accessed in the past 3 months. It was accessed 300 times in this period. His book, Victorian Sensation, of course, was the winner of the 2002 Pfizer Prize. The Victorian Sensation is a perfect example of why Jim's work has become so influential and why reading his publications is such an enjoyable experience. Jim manages to be extremely creative in his writing, while at the same time exhaustive in his research. In Victorian Sensation, he marshals evidence drawn from correspondence, journals, cartoons, published articles and books, and many, many other sources. And he effectively weaves this into a riveting story about the publication, reception, and secret authorship of Robert Chambers' Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. We learn, for example, about the extensive measures that Chambers took to keep his authorship a secret, about the speculations as to who the author was, and about attempts to expose him as the author. This is fascinating stuff. Talking about secrets, I have 2 embarrassing ones to make public that concern Jim's work. I thought I'd better come clean now, rather than have someone else expose these skeletons rattling in my closet. First, if you look in the bibliography of my book, Victorian Popularizers of Science, you'll see that I've made an error in listing the subtitle of Jim's book, Victorian Sensation. Instead of listing it as the extraordinary publication, reception, and secret authorship of the Vestiges, I have the extraordinary publication, deception, and secret authorship of the Vestiges. Jim, can you ever forgive me? Second, and maybe this will make up for the first secret, I will now admit to having a well-used copy of Victorian Sensation in my bedroom at all times. My bedroom also happens to be my study, but I have a very small number of books there that I constantly return to, and Jim's is one of them. It is an indispensable resource, and this leads me to my second point about why Jim's work is so influential, above and beyond his abilities to tell a gripping story informed by extensive research. Jim's work often has broader implications for how we do the history of science. In Victorian Sensation, he lays out an entirely new way of viewing the historical significance of the Vestiges. This book revealed how the greatest communications revolution since the Renaissance changed how science was conveyed to a vastly increased reading public. By showing how historians of science could successfully integrate the work of historians of print culture, Jim opened up countless new lines of investigation. He expanded our horizons as historians of science and inspired many of us, myself included, to integrate insights from the study of print culture into our work. I am awaiting with great anticipation the publication of his next book, titled Visions of Science, Books and Readers at the Dawn of the Victorian Age. I've seen the proofs. The book will be out early in 2014, and most certainly it will be another spectacular contribution to the field. But for now, we will have to be content with what may be a sample of the book to come, as Jim will speak on Life on the Moon, Newspapers on Earth. Jim Secord.
Right. Well, first of all, I have to say this is the first time I've ever given a distinguished lecture. I think that's because it's in the title, but it certainly, I must say, I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's an extremely distinguished offer, if nothing else. Science is news. Take this front page from the London Sun, a picture it shared with hundreds of newspapers toward the end of the last millennium, when a total eclipse was visible in Europe for the last time. Perhaps the first time ever, the Sun had no headline. Its masthead here becomes the caption of the picture that everyone could see in the newspapers. But no one, in fact, at least in England, could see on the ground because of bad weather. The newspaper makes reality, and the Sun could shine forth on the day as the people's paper. Ironically, it's only since newspapers began to recede in importance as the way most people get the news that historians have begun to study them and understand their centrality in the making of science. Although the situation is changing, newspapers still typically figure in the history of science as evidence for the diffusion of innovation. The laboratory, observatory, and the field can seem really distant from the anonymous, ephemeral battle and bustle of newspaper production. To understand how newspapers are part of the making of science, we need, I think, to pay close attention to time. There's been something of a spatial turn in history of science in recent years, but historians, rather oddly given their profession, have sometimes forgotten about the importance of sequencing and time. And this is true particularly, I think, in the cases of journalism and of scientific inquiry. We need to think of science, like newspapers, in these sequential, serial, temporal terms, as a process occurring day to day, week to week, month to month, year to year. This is routinely done in studies of discoveries, but almost never in relationship to the ordinary, ongoing public scientific debate and discussion. Once we do this, the chronology of science, and put these two chronologies together, of science and journalism, we're in a position to see science and the press not in opposition, but rather engaged in a powerful, close, fruitful, and sometimes uncomfortable relation. Ideals of journalistic objectivity developed directly in association with the new sciences of the early 19th century. And in turn, the practitioners of the sciences drew on interactions with wider audiences. The same, of course, remains the case in the very different circumstances of the present day, most obviously through the internet. Now, today, I'll be exploring these issues by examining the most successful and celebrated piece of scientific news ever perpetrated, when a New York newspaper announced in 1835 that the astronomer John Herschel, using a telescope of unprecedented power, had made the greatest scientific discovery of all time. So, let's start with another and older sun, the sun of New York, a city that was well on its way in 1835 to becoming the central commercial center of the young American Republic. On the 21st of August, 1835, Sun readers learned from a brief notice that the Edinburgh Courant, just arrived on the latest ship, had announced that Sir John Herschel had made, quote, some astronomical discoveries on the moon of the most wonderful description by means of an immense telescope of an entirely new principle. 4 days later, a front-page feature began quoting extracts from a supplement to a periodical called the Edinburgh Journal of Science. This first installment was subdued, even dull, describing how this new telescope was made, incorporating the up-to-date innovation of an oxyhydrogen microscope, which transfused artificial light through the focal object of vision. None of the articles that the Sun went on to print were illustrated, but I've included images from them during the talk. This one is actually rather unusually for a depiction of a scientific instrument. It's from a snuff box made in Germany. You can see, in fact, Herschel on the right using the telescope. He's actually looking through the oxyhydrogen microscope at the telescopic image in order to be able to see things with unprecedented power. Now, according to this account, Herschel had sailed on a secret mission to the Cape of Good Hope, and by the end of 1834, the telescope that we see here was ready. Its extraordinary discoveries, which were made in January, were outlined in the Sun's second article. The instrument had revealed huge basalt columns, which could be seen with higher magnification as to be covered with fields of dark red flowers. An extensive lunar forest had trees resembling English yews. Reducing the magnification, the astronomers then surveyed the whole lunar surface, searching for likely places for animals, and later in the evening began to observe what they called specimens of conscious existence. There were herds of little bison, blue goats with a single horn, and water birds akin to pelicans and cranes. The astronomers also saw an amphibious creature of a spherical form, which rolled with great velocity across a pebbled beach. After 2 nights of cloudy weather, further discoveries ensued, which the Sun described on the 3rd day of its reporting. Shellfish, birds, small reindeer, elk, moose, horned bears, and, most intriguingly, biped beavers. These were similar to the terrestrial species, but lacked tails and walked on 2 feet, and as you can see, they carried their young in their arms. Their huts were well constructed, and the smoke rising from them showed that they were familiar with the use of fire. The Sun's 4th series of extracts on the 28th of August announced the most astonishing discovery of all. Successfully using more powerful lenses, Herschel and his team had observed flocks of large winged creatures, graceful and erect, with a general similarity to human beings. They were 4 feet in height, they had short, glossy, copper-colored hair, prominent mouths, and thick beards. From their rapid gesticulations, the astronomers inferred that they were rational beings and gave them the scientific name Vespertilio Homo, or Batman. A more advanced race, taller, lighter in color, but similar in general appearance, had been seen too. Further observations were delayed, but other large mammals and a near angelic bat race had been found by 2 assistants in March. These were announced in the 5th and 6th set of extracts, which appeared as August drew to a close. As the article stressed, these lunar wonders were witnessed by the civil and military authorities of the colony and by several Episcopal, Wesleyan, and other ministers. With this testimony secured, a preliminary report was sent back to Britain and published in the non-existent supplement to the non-existent Edinburgh Journal of Science. Now, it's at this point that everyone who writes about this story enthuses in vague terms about an extraordinary explosion of public interest. As Edgar Allan Poe noted, it was the greatest hit in the way of sensation, of merely popular sensation, ever made by any similar fiction, either in America or Europe. Sun editorials claim daily sales of over 19,000 copies of the paper and 60,000 copies of a pamphlet version. 2 Yale science professors are said to have traveled to the Sun offices, especially to check out the story. A captain is said to have set sail for the Cape in order to see the wonders of lunar life for himself. A delegation of Baptist clergymen is supposed to ask if there was any scientific method for conveying the gospel to brethren in these newly explored regions. Believed by almost everyone who read it, spread throughout the world, the discoveries became an international sensation, discussed and debated in Europe as well as America. Well, in my view, anyone who uses the word sensation ought to be viewed with suspicion. Alas, there were no Yale professors, no Baptist ministers, and no sea captains setting sail. The Sun, like all antebellum newspapers, was eager to exaggerate publication figures and make as much out of the controversy as it could, but its selective and misleading quotations have served ever since as the main source for the reception. Now, it's interesting. A huge amount has been written about the moon hoax, including a well-researched book by the nonfiction writer Matthew Goodman and a detailed account in the Museum of Hoaxes website. In the history of journalism, it is the classic media hoax and a turning point in the emergence of the cheap newspaper press in the United States. Within the history of science, on the other hand, the story has had a relatively minor place, mainly in debates about extraterrestrial life, or it's used as an object lesson in the gullibility of the non-scientific public. Tellingly, these histories rarely intersect. To those who study newspapers, science is important to the story, but for reasons that are not entirely satisfactory. To historians of science, it really generally doesn't seem to matter much if it occurred in the newspapers at all. There is so much mythology surrounding the episode that we need to clear the ground. Before we laugh at the gullibility of 19th century Americans, it makes sense to examine why we have been so willing to believe such tall tales about the reception. The point I want to develop first begins from a suggestion in Mike Crow's fine study of the debate about extraterrestrial life, that the so-called moon hoax wasn't a hoax at all. We can start off by looking at why the articles appeared in the Sun in the first place. Their author was Richard Adams Locke, who had immigrated from Britain just before the Sun had been founded. In London, he had been an ultra-radical journalist, one of the writers for The Republican, a notorious, illegal, unstamped public periodical. Looking for better prospects, for this kind of radicalism didn't go down so well in Britain, Locke left for the United States and became a crime reporter, and in 1834, he was editor of The Sun. But Locke brought to his work at The Sun not only his experience as a journalist, but his fiercely held democratic and anti-theological principles. In publishing the articles on lunar life, his target was the Scottish astronomical writer Thomas Dick, the celebrated Christian philosopher who had been defrocked for seducing his maidservant and who spent the rest of his life atoning for his sin by writing works with detailed accounts of life on other planets, as one does. Dick argued that governments should cease making war and instead, practically, spend money constructing huge geometrical structures that, visible from outer space, could be seen by extraterrestrial intelligences. His books sold extremely well and were widely read on both sides of the Atlantic. They outlined the political economy and statistics of lunar life. Several years later, Locke outlined his reasons for writing the articles in The Sun. He had wanted, he said, to undermine the imaginative school of philosophy encouraged by Dick. I was convinced, moreover, he recalled, that the theological and devotional encroachments upon the legitimate province of science, which had become so manifest and avowed an object of the school to which I allude, were calculated to bind in chains of sectarian faith and conventional dogmatism inquiries into matters of fact that should be as free as the mountain air and as uncharted as the light of heaven. Democrats on both sides of the Atlantic railed against what Locke termed the worldly wise adaptation to the demands of the Kant market. Even John Herschel's astronomical writings, too, were contaminated, he thought, by theology. Locke feared that one studious youth, encouraged to avoid sterner labors and mathematical rigor, were developing a puerile and prurient appetite for the fanciful and marvelous. Some readers, mechanical men and artisans, deserved, he thought, something better. Benjamin Day, who was the paper's proprietor, had hired Locke because he was the best police writer of his generation, but the two men also shared many views on politics and religion. Before founding the Sun, in fact, Day had helped to launch the Daily Sentinel, a radical newspaper that supported labor agitation and the socialist feminist Fanny Wright. The Sun had nothing of this rabble-rousing anti-religious rhetoric of its predecessor. Day, in fact, had learned his lesson, but instead attempted to achieve its goals indirectly. For both Day and Locke wanted to see intellectual life in the American Republic break free of European class and religious prejudice. Locke wrote the Moon articles, he said, in a white heat, often having to ask the compositor for the last word on one page of his manuscript in order to complete the sentence on the next. Kant, he thought, was everywhere and needed to be destroyed. In this context, the Sun's lunar campaign was not meant to be a hoax, but a radical anti-theological satire. What happened when the story hit the streets is something that no one at the Sun had anticipated. Locke assumed that readers would identify his target, but the satire was so subtle and so well conceived, and the target was so relatively esoteric, that no one seems to have got the point. Whether or not they believed the story, many read it as bearing potential marks of truth. From this point on, Locke's intention became irrelevant. Instead of debating the validity of theological speculation in science, readers were discussing whether his findings were true or false. As anyone who studied the science of this period will know, the foundations for claims about knowledge were uncertain, more so than at any time since the mid-17th century. And this was the problem. Especially in America, scientific satire proved unexpectedly difficult to interpret. The realms of writing in which it touched, this kind of writing, factual reporting, news, fictional romance, were fluid and shifting. Only a few weeks before, Poe had faced the same dilemma in deciding whether his own lunar epic, the story of Hans Pfaall, should be presented as fact or fiction. Any text of this kind was bound to be generically unstable. In writing the articles, Locke had employed the standard techniques of Swiftian satire, staying close to his originals, but going just a bit further into what he thought would be seen as the realms of the absurd. He used scientific vocabulary, referring to notes, plates, and appendices. His style parodied that of Herschel and other astronomers, combining dry technicalities with Byronic flights of verbal extravagance. Several passages directly echo Dick's writings. But the feature that I want to stress is one that I tried to bring out in my descriptions of the articles. Readers were presented with a dual time frame. One was the day-to-day sequence of the revelations experienced by Herschel and his colleagues at the Cape. The other was the day-to-day series of extracts printed in the Sun. The two narratives worked together to give an extraordinary sense of participating in a discovery. In this way, the time frames of newspaper production mimicked those of science in the making. We need, therefore, to recognize the serial character of the Sun's narrative, set up as a day-by-day sequence of revelations within a plausible setting of prior publication. By implication, the Edinburgh Courier and the Journal of Science had already validated the story. A reader of the first installment had to be pretty confident of their knowledge of optics before disagreeing with the claimed support of recognized men of science and references to questions like the oxyhydrogen microscope. The second and third day's reports included the discovery of forests and large animals, as we saw. Now, this was remarkable, but really, in terms of contemporary debates about lunar life, it was by no means implausible. Take Philip Hone, a New York merchant and politician who commented on these early episodes in the narrative in his diary. In sober truth, if this account is true, it is most enormously wonderful, and if it is a fable, the manner of its relation, with all its scientific details, names of persons employed, and the beauty of its glowing descriptions, will give this ingenious history a place with Gulliver's Travels and Robinson Crusoe. Hone did not, in other words, simply accept what he had read, but suspended judgment while admiring the skill with which the account was put together. Hone read the early installment several days late because no other newspapers had reported the story, and he certainly didn't subscribe to The Sun. Ultimately, the newspapers began to print the story because The Sun was selling, in fact, in unprecedented numbers, with interest reaching fever pitch, and the competition needed to react, even against what most of them had regarded as a grubby sheet. Their strategies varied. On August 28th, this is just after the first episode or two has been published, two of the morning papers have carried the story. One, the Mercantile Advertiser, reprinted most of the account about the telescope and was cautiously optimistic about its truth of its findings about lunar forests and so forth. Herschel was known to be at the Cape preparing to announce highly important discoveries, so it made quite a lot of sense. And another paper, the Daily Advertiser, went even further. We commence on this day the publication of one of the most extraordinary articles that has ever appeared in the English language. No article, we believe, has appeared for years that will command so general a perusal and publication. Sir John has added a stock of knowledge to the present age that will immortalize his name and place it high on the page of science. A third paper, the Evening Post, was able to exclude extracts from the whole story thus far, including that morning's much more astounding announcement about Batman. But it did this, and this is important, without any comment. Only one paper, the Evening American, was openly skeptical at this point, printing a joke letter from a terrestrial recommending that the articles be bound up in The Sun with Gulliver's Travels. On Saturday, the 29th of August, the discussion reached full flood. But with Batman having been cited in the previous morning's Sun, elements of exaggeration were becoming all too apparent. And this is the important point, I think. No further New York papers gave any credence to the story, although most reprinted the entire set of articles. The Journal of Commerce, which was one of the older traditional papers, hitherto silent, labeled it outright as a hoax. Of the two papers that had been misled, the Daily Advertiser continued its reporting, but was now skeptical, noting in an editorial that our correspondent at the lunatic asylum claims the merit of the discovery. Outside the metropolis, where gossip spread less quickly, a few editors appear to have been more willing to accept the story as fact. The most prominent was the Daily Advertiser in Albany, which welcomed the findings with unspeakable emotions of pleasure and astonishment. Not surprisingly, this editor was suspected by other newspapers of being in cahoots with The Sun. Such comments, as in the case of Orson Welles' celebrated Invasion from Mars broadcast a century later, were far less widespread than one would guess from the historical literature on this episode. The Sun itself, of course, was very eager to keep the story going and made as much as possible out of the editors who had been led momentarily astray. Even papers that had been vigorously satirical were made to sound as if they had been fooled by the most extravagant elements of the tale. Editorials were quoted out of context again and again. As a result, it looked as though virtually all the competing newspapers had swallowed the story whole. But as the Philadelphia U.S. Gazette put it even before The Sun finished its extracts, the story is said to be a hoax. It may be so, but how can it be a hoax if no one is hoaxed by it? As the ambiguity surrounding the reports began to be resolved, readers faced the problem of identifying what they had been reading. If not a scientific article, what was it? One newspaper hailed Locke as the inventor of an entirely new species of literature, which we may call the scientific novel. In fact, Mr. Locke has opened up a new vein, as original, as curious, as beautiful as any of the greatest geniuses that ever wrote. He looks forward into futurity and adapts his characters in the light of science. Here we have the possibility of a new American tradition of literature. A few tried to read the series as a satirical political allegory, but no one, at least in America, suspected a satire on religion. Even Thomas Dick, in his next book, simply condemned the author as a liar. So the most common strategy was to label the articles as a hoax, with the main aim being deception rather than satire. There were, so far as I can tell, no precedents, in fact, that anyone could have remembered for intentionally false stories in a newspaper. The only American example cited in the literature is when Benjamin Franklin had issued reports to fool British tacticians during the Revolutionary War. The verb to hoax, in fact, dates from the early decades of the 19th century and was becoming common in other areas of life. But readers now understood that they had been taken in by the newspapers themselves. No wonder a few were fooled into considering the man-bat seriously. There had never been anything quite like this before. Having inadvertently invented not only lunar batmen, but the very idea of newspaper hoaxing, the Sun now had opportunities available far beyond those that would have been afforded by an anti-theological satire. The lunar discoveries made the paper both famous and more widely read, although how much more widely read is debatable. As every history of journalism recalls, the Sun, which had been founded in 1833, was a pioneer in transforming the American newspaper. The traditional papers, such as the Mercantile Advertiser or the Journal of Commerce, depended on subscribers who paid the large sum of $10 a year, 6 cents a day, for their daily newspaper. These older journals were organs of political parties and featured commercial news of interest to their elite clientele. In contrast, the Sun addressed artisans and the lower middle classes, stressing useful knowledge with fact-packed features about everyday life. It mixed these with editorials and libelous attacks on fraud, corruption, and the competing papers. As with the radical unstamped press in Britain, newsboys sold copies on the streets for only a penny. As the motto on the masthead of the Sun read, "The Sun, it shines for all." Read as a hoax, the Moon story raised a question of public judgment central to the democratic purpose of the new penny press. With this issue, we come to the heart of what this episode was about in the United States. Editors hedged their bets and let their readers decide. P.T. Barnum's career as a purveyor of humbug is unthinkable without this policy, and his first great success, an exhibition of George Washington's 160-year-old nurse, was being advertised in the Sun just as Locke published his articles. The same stress on the need for judgment is found in the penny paper's reports from the police courts, such as those that Locke had been preparing. Crime reports, with their titillating brew of violence and perversity, may seem pretty distant from science. Yet for both, readers were centrally concerned with objectivity and judgment, often on questions where truth was difficult to determine. The Moon story, read as a hoax, served as a warning that nothing could be taken for granted. Its reliance on impeccable-sounding scientific sources made it a telling commentary on the ideals of objectivity. Readers needed to be on their guard, and the elite papers that had swallowed the story could be revealed as corrupt and biased. They, the Sun said, were not training the public mind. Instead, they tended to reprint the Moon story verbatim, just as they printed boring congressional debates and financial reports. The editor of the Journal of Commerce, on the other hand, adopted a higher moral ground in exposing the deception, in line with its refusal to print advertisements for theaters and shows. Other subscription papers preferred satire adapted particularly to their wealthy clientele. Thus, the Commercial Advertiser issued a fake advertisement for a 9,000 building lots in the territory explored by Sir John Herschel. Also available for sale was a gang of shepherds, being healthy, full-grown specimens of the man-bat, suitable for exhibition. It would be misleading, as these quotations suggest, to underestimate the skepticism of the subscription papers. But the real question does not involve whether the editors accepted or rejected the story, but the way in which the Sun highlighted the issue of public judgment in the New Republic. For all three of the New York penny papers, in fact, the moon story did prove something of a defining moment. The Transcript started its own series of satirical lunar discoveries. The Herald, eventually the most successful of the penny papers, issued hoaxing articles about Locke's early life, stating that he had a degree at Cambridge, but abandoned a clerical career for astronomy after getting a chambermaid in some awkward plight. There seems to be a theme developing there. For these penny papers, the moon story was seen as a skillful joke, carried too far and made the subject of too much profit, but putting issues of evidence, fact, and objective reporting on the agenda. These concerns also, I think, explain the visual character of the moon story. We often think, I think, of spectacle as inimical to judgment, but in working in middle-class culture on both sides of the Atlantic, it was thought to be essential. The best way to ensure truth was to see for oneself. Once the series was complete, the Sun issued lithographs to accompany a pamphlet version. Later in the autumn, sightseers at Hannington's New York show could see a moving lunar diorama painted on over 1,000 feet of canvas. The Sun printed a 2-column woodcut of the panorama as an illustration, one of the earliest in the newspaper's history. Even the Australians were impressed. As the Sydney Gazette commented, "The Americans beat us hollow as to exhibitions." Theater productions included a comic spectacle at New York's Brewery Theater and 2 plays in Philadelphia. One, which was called an entire new laughable entertainment with new scenery, dresses, and so forth, was called Moonshine and featured a character called Mr. Copernicus Skysad. Another was a blackface comedy featuring Jim Crow on a moon voyage in a balloon. It was often commented that the moon story had provided a diversion from the debate about the abolition of slavery that was tearing the country apart. But it is clear, not least from the hierarchy of races that the Sun described in the moon, that this issue of race was just below the surface. If individuals were supposed to be able to see and judge by themselves in Jacksonian America, the situation was very different in Europe and in the various outlying territories and colonies. The moon story took about 3 weeks to reach the European ports. Reports are known from London, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Hamburg, Paris, Cadiz, Lucerne, Lille, Seville, Florence, Livorno, Naples, Ravenna, and Milan, among other cities. The accounts then traveled on well-established colonial news circuits, something I want to follow up more, so that Spanish versions appeared in Havana and Mexico City, while British ones were recycled in New South Wales and Tasmania. At least since the 1820s, newspapers had served for the reporting of astronomical news of all kinds, the most immediate precedent being the interest in Halley's Comet, which had been orchestrated as the year's great astronomical event. Imported newspapers carrying the moon story did reach the Cape of Good Hope, where, of course, John Herschel was, but it doesn't seem to have been picked up there as a story in the newspapers themselves, perhaps out of deference to Herschel's presence. Moon journalism, however, did catch on especially well in France, where there were 3 Paris and 2 provincial pamphlet editions as well. Here the satire was retargeted against men of science as a class. In the constrained, censored world of Paris journalism, the comic magazines looked for any opportunity to puncture the pretensions of those in positions of state authority. The leaders of the Academy of Sciences wanted to maintain control over observations in a system run from the Paris Observatory. François Arago, the secretary of the Academy, looked to the Republic of Science to provide a political model for the Republican nation and saw the moon story's success as indicating the distressing incapacity of the French people to make sound judgments. He was furious that Herschel's good name was being drawn into dispute, and he suspected that one of his rivals was actually responsible for planting the story in the New York newspaper. The weekly Le Charivari showed bourgeois women using telescopes to search for men on the moon rather than following the progress of Halley's Comet. There were songs in Paris with lithographed covers, one of which, Ma Lune, showed a Batman in Paris longing to go home. Another, which I have yet to find, showed Batmen in the custody of Parisian gendarmes singing Au clair de la lune. In England, the lunar discoveries were not, and this is quite interesting, I think, generally announced until the spring of 1836, and they were largely on the basis of the French reports, which had been imported through the English language Parisian press. The radical satirist printed a mock letter from the astronomer Herschel. Sorry about the humor is not always the highest level in this, I'm afraid. Noting that the old world and the new world are both ringing with my reputed discoveries concerning the moon. Those discoveries, however, they're nothing less than a gross deception put forward by an impudent fellow of a Frenchman. After a very windy night, this Herschel claimed to have found a real inhabitant of the moon at the end of his telescope. The autocrat of all the lunatics then tells him of a huge structure in the moon, rotting and falling apart, called the church establishment. In the British Isles, Locke's story could once again become a satirical comment on politics and religion. Now, there's a huge story here to say about the uses of the moon story outside of New York. I haven't really said anything, for example, about its spread throughout other American newspapers. But one thing I think that's very important to stress here is that viewed and republished as a completed narrative, as it almost always was in these kind of contexts, rather than a series of serial revelations, the moon story had none of the ambiguity that characterized the first 2 days of the reception. Editors and readers could only wonder at the credulity of their transatlantic brethren. The way in which journalists appeared to have been duped was met with amazement. As the Liverpool Journal noted, there's never been a more ingenious or successful fraud perpetrated on the credulity of mankind. Read as an entertaining instance of human gullibility, perhaps especially of Americans, it reassumed much of its intended function as satire. Over the next year, newspapers in many different countries reissued the articles from the imported papers. Local printers saw the lunar discoveries as a novelty item. The story was extracted, almost always secondhand from these British or French sources, generally in columns in the newspapers labeled intelligence or digest, rather than as news. One of the most remarkable versions of the news of the moon story appeared in Welsh in the 1850s as a pamphlet from the printer and inventor John Jones of Llanwrst. Based on the pamphlet version that had been published in London 2 decades earlier, this was many short works that Jones issued as part of a campaign on behalf of the Welsh language. In Naples, at the center of the Italian print trade, 3 different firms issued lithographs in 1836 showing the discoveries. The interest almost certainly has much to do here with a tradition of illustrating lunar life, which went back to a famous mid-18th century series by the great engraver Filippo Morgan, and the subsequent work of the Topographical Office of the Kingdom of Naples, which was very noted for producing not just pictures of volcanoes, but of local landscapes. It's really a very distinguished landscape lithographic tradition and printing tradition generally. And you can see this in the moon prints, an elaborate series of 6 prints by Gaetano Dura, which was targeted at tourists and collectors, told a weekly narrative that satirized the imported American story as a parable of colonial conquest. Here you can see the boat going up to the moon, and bat women were discovered, and also batmen were then turned into slaves who provided the motive power for public transport. There's clearly something going on here which would be worth investigating more about an attack on the slave trade and the treatment of indigenous peoples. Well, it's not a long step from these fantasies about extraterrestrial colonization to the very down-to-earth work that John Herschel was doing at the Cape. His journey to the southern tip of Africa has, in fact, become an iconic symbol of British imperial science. This leads, I think, to the question of the significance of any that the moon story has for an understanding of scientific practice, which is, of course, central to what we do as historians of science. For American astronomers, the moon story was both an opportunity and, to be frank, a nightmare. Newspapers were almost only the way for them to obtain quick publication in the United States, so discoveries were often first published in the local press. Peer review publication was not at all taken for granted, and in many ways didn't exist. Halley's comet made his observational progress around the world in that way, in newspapers, and not so much in specialist journals. Moreover, antebellum astronomers were engaged in campaigns to obtain support for their observatories, as when Dennis and Olmsted and Elias Loomis wrote to the New Haven Daily Herald, announcing that Halley's comet could be seen through the college's splendid new telescope. Unfortunately, their letter appeared in the Herald alongside extracts from the Moon story, which was still very much in the news. The Sun, not unexpectedly, connected the two discoveries, claiming triumphant proof for Herschel's lunar findings. The New York Herald invented a story that Olmsted and Lewis had actually believed the Herschel reports, when in fact they had already contradicted them in a later issue of the paper. This was soon elaborated into an account that the hapless professors had actually visited the Sun offices to verify the story. This was actually a story that was repeated in an academic article just in the last few years. All of this was denied, but as I say, was constantly recycled. My point is simply that such stories could arise because newspapers represented an integral part of the economy of scientific publication. These things were already appearing together in the newspapers. There was no way out of the publication situation. So what about Herschel himself? He really was at the Cape, and he learned about the discoveries from a passing American captain, who also brought newspapers reprinting the articles. Needless to say, this captain was neither a believer nor had he traveled to the Cape specifically for this purpose. Herschel reportedly had a good laugh and invited his visitors to see how on very humble a scale his astronomical observations are here conducted. His worry, which he expressed on several occasions, was that potential contributors to science, excited by thoughts of the lunar wonders, would be put off contributing to really so modest an enterprise. His concern was motivated partly by the dependence of his own scientific schemes on individual observers throughout the world. Throughout the months when the newspapers were carrying the Moon story, Herschel was attempting to establish a global system of weather observers tied together by the same networks of newspapers that had carried the hoax. Even more strikingly, Herschel's scientific writings were deeply implicated in the very ambiguities that characterized the discussion of extraterrestrial life in the public press. His treatise on astronomy, which had appeared in New York only months before, could be used by both sides in the debate about lunar life. It denied there was any lunar atmosphere, but held out the possibility that intelligent life might be found there anyway. Telescopes, Herschel had written, might yet be greatly improved before we could expect to see signs of inhabitants as manifested by edifices or changes in the surfaces of the soil. Later on, he did not condemn the Sun's discoveries outright, but found in them a humbling implication of how much further there was to go in astronomy. Herschel's writings, in other words, were not outside the newspaper debate, but expressed many of the speculative views that had led Locke to publish in the first place. As Margaret Herschel wrote from the Cape, it was easy to see how the New Yorkers had reportedly been fooled. "It is only a great pity," she said, "that it is not true. But if grandsons stride on, as grandfathers have done, as wonderful things may be accomplished." Privately, her husband went even further, endorsing William Herschel's belief that below its fiery exterior, the sun had a cool, solid nucleus which might be inhabited, as this contemporary comic pamphlet actually shows. If the Solarians proved to be intelligent, science, quite literally, would be in the sun. The Moon story, of course, proved in the end to have its most lasting impact as and in fiction, particularly by inspiring Jules Verne. But its extraordinary success and ambiguity make it especially useful for thinking about how scientific work is taken up, discussed, and used. In addressing such topics, three assumptions tend to be dominant, unless issues of communication are being explicitly raised. The first is that the spread of knowledge is instantaneous. We too easily forget that it takes time for information to travel, and that receptions typically occur hours, days, weeks, or years later. The second is that information can become universal, that it spreads through an entire population. So-called popular knowledge, understood in this way, is effectively disembodied. And finally, there's an assumption about authority, that audiences either accept or reject a particular finding, rather than shaping it to the needs of their own circumstances. Now, everyone at this meeting knows that these assumptions about communication are false, but it is striking how thoroughly they continue to structure thinking, even the very language that we use. Despite its pivotal position in the history of journalism, the events that I have discussed in this lecture are regularly presented as a delusion that swept across the world. The mass public, as represented in newspapers and pamphlets, is seen to have acted virtually instantaneously and in unison. Highly specific contexts, from rural Welsh printers to Neapolitan lithographers, are juxtaposed as they were reacting to the same events. Even in our own field, the emergence of the study of popular science as a subject of separate investigation during the past decade has tended, perhaps inevitably, to reinforce the idea that the popular has a meaningful, generic unity defined in part through its distinction from actual scientific practice. These assumptions have created the real moon hoax, a hoax about reception that has been far more successful, more pervasive, and more insidious than any claim about biped beavers and Batman. It matters not only because of the role of the particular story I've discussed in histories of journalism and in public trust in institutions, but also, and I think more significantly, for the general ways in which we think about the audiences for science and other forms of knowledge. Visible to all, perhaps especially as public spectacles, the findings of the sciences have been critical to the creation of news as a specific kind of objective commodity. The receptions of Locke's satire brings to the fore the way in which public judgment in a democracy depends upon the accessibility of information and the ability of ordinary people to discriminate fact from fiction. Certainly, at least from the early 19th century, science has been a resource for ideas of objectivity, but it has never been a stable one. As I've stressed, astronomers depended on the reading public both as a source of potential contributors and as a repository of ideas about how science should work. Their labors at the telescope were not separate from the newspaper debate, but bound up with them in the circuit of communication. Science, as Herschel's own ambiguous pronouncements on extraterrestrial life reveal, could never serve as the foundation for the creation of a narrow, empiricist version of objectivity in the newspaper press. Rather, ideals of objectivity had to depend upon processes of public debate. There was no escape from democratic judgment, open channels of communication, and a critical, informed readership in determining whether facts are true. At a time when newspapers are in decline and the standards of reporting are subject to daily scrutiny and doubt, it might be worth keeping a bit of history in mind. Thank you.